George Patton witnessed the horrific conditions at the Ohrdruf concentration camp with his own eyes on April 12, 1945. What the Third Army found inside the barbed wire fences went far beyond anything Patton had mentally prepared for. The general, who had never backed down while sweeping across France, ended up vomiting by a hut. That night, he wrote that he finally understood the true nature of this regime firsthand. 5 months later, Patton ruled over the remnants of that same regime as the military governor of Bavaria. German officers and officials defeated in the war, now under his authority, never retracted a single word. Having served that regime, they still defended it both privately and publicly. Patton did not destroy them, he protected them. He let them keep their offices because he firmly believed the country couldn't function without them. He even told American reporters that the whole effort to purge these people was just a big fuss. The man who had stood inside the Ohrdruf concentration camp was now standing in the way between the regime's henchmen and those trying to remove them. In less than 3 weeks, Patton lost his command, not taken away by the enemy, but by his oldest friends. History over the next 50 years would prove that Patton's seemingly wrong choice was actually the right one. The war that made George Patton was over, and he could feel it slipping away from his life. On that same April day when he walked out of the Ohrdruf concentration camp, he sat down to write a letter to his wife. He admitted that he loved war. He loved the responsibility, the speed, and the roar of the bombing. He told her that peace would be a kind of destruction for him. By August 10th, he expressed this more starkly in his diary. He wrote that another war was over, and now all that was left was to sit and wait for the funeral procession to arrive. This was the state of mind Patton carried into the task that would end his political career. He had requested to be sent to a combat command against Japan, but instead, he got a desk, a province, and a problem with no clean solution. In the summer of 1945, he became the military governor of Bavaria, ruling over millions of defeated civilians in a land full of ruins, hunger, and stalled machines. A soldier who once measured life by miles, captured and rivers crossed, was now expected to get a broken civilian society running again. It was here that Patton collided with the contradiction that defined the rest of his life. Those who knew how to run Bavaria, the clerks who kept water flowing, the engineers who knew which power plants could be saved, the officials familiar with courts, railroad schedules, and food distribution were almost without exception products of the very regime the Third Army had spent a year destroying. According to orders from above, this disqualified them from office. The directive managing the occupied zone was the famous Staff Chief's Joint Directive No. 1067, which was crystal clear. Anyone who was more than nominally a member of the party must be removed from any position above common laborer. Technical skill was no excuse. Administrative convenience, no excuse. The men who ran the Third Reich were not to be trusted to run its remains. For Patton, sitting in Bavaria, watching the lights flicker, and facing a starving population hanging by a thread, this sounded less like justice and more like havoc. He looked at the ruins before him, then at the only people who seemed capable of fixing them, and came to a conclusion that seemed pure common sense to him. In his diary, he bluntly laid out the logic. Under rules demanding the purging of all who called themselves party members, the only untainted Germans left were the very young, the very old, and those who had spent the war in concentration camps. Anyone who had held a proper job, run a business, or managed a department had been forced to pledge loyalty to the party just to survive. Removing them all meant there was no one left to run the country. On the surface, this was the argument of an administrator. It also contained a harsh logic that even today is hard to fully dismiss. A modern country does not run on idealism. It runs on the mundane skills accumulated by thousands who keep the boring machines running. And in 1945, Bavaria, almost every one of those people had a marred past. Patton was right that without them, the machines would stop. What Patton could not or would not see was the calculation that the architects of the concentration camps had long depended on. Being indispensable was always the regime's most secret defense. Make yourself too important to lose, so that those inheriting the ruins would need you too much to ask what you had done. Patton, the most American of generals, walked straight into the oldest deal the Third Reich offered and mistook it for efficiency. He saw Aldersdorf with his own eyes in April. By August, he was signing papers that let the very same people from Aldersdorf stay behind their desks. The distance between the two moments shaped everything that followed, and Patton crossed that gap without seeming to notice that the ground beneath him had shifted. While Patton was busy searching for reasons to keep the administration of that regime at their desks, the regime's own officers were proving with their actions that, deep down, these people remained stubbornly unrepentant. Across the Channel, in a country villa named Trent Park, north of London, the British were holding the core elite of German military commanders. These prisoners of war were treated like honored guests. They had fine wine, good food, servants attending them, and gardens to stroll in. They felt smug about their captors' supposed softness. One even wrote home, bragging that his family should envy the living conditions he enjoyed. Yet none of them expected that hidden in the walls were listening devices. Concealed microphones transmitted their conversations to a room full of eavesdroppers, Jewish refugees who had escaped the regime these generals had served. They took turns on watch, meticulously recording every word, while the generals thought no enemy could hear them. What these recordings captured shattered the German officer class's excuses decades before they were invented. Behind the locked doors of this comfortable captivity, the generals spoke freely about large-scale crimes their troops had committed on the Eastern Front. They knew what had happened. They always knew. What shocked the most was not fear, but the absence of fear. Those atrocious crimes were discussed in a casual, highly technical, and unemotional manner. A few expressed genuine disgust and spoke frankly, but many showed no sign of shame. Even as prisoners defeated by their enemies, they defended the regime they had served, with unrepentant stubbornness being the most fitting description of these captured officers. This was the truth behind the surrender. The German military officers did not crumble in confession. Their leadership retained intact beliefs, even as prisoners. That fall, while Patton still ruled Bavaria, the process of whitewashing these beliefs had already quietly begun. In November, just 6 months after the guns fell silent, a group of German army field marshals and senior officers submitted a memorandum to the Allied courts at Nuremberg, offering to testify on behalf of the entire German army. Their message was simple and bold. The army had kept its distance from the party and secret police. The army did not support the dictator's decisions. The army had preserved its honor. This was the first formal draft of a lie that would take 50 years to fully unravel, authored by the very prisoners awaiting trial. Patton knew nothing of the Trent Park transcripts. He had never read the general's memorandum. But the argument he made in Bavaria was essentially the same argument those officers presented at Nuremberg, dressed in 2 different uniforms at their core. The Germans said, "We only obeyed. We did not believe." Patton said, "They only obeyed. They did not believe." The defeated offered excuses, and ironically, the conquerors picked up those excuses and loudly proclaimed them the cruelest irony of the entire Second World War. In Bavaria, Patton put this belief into practice even before he voiced it. Through one official after another, his military government kept the tainted people in place. Wherever the policy demanded purges, Patton always found reasons to retain personnel. Those who were skilled, educated, and technically indispensable bankers, administrators, engineers remained in their roles. To Patton, a province on the brink of famine could not afford the luxury of pursuing purity. All of this became known to the outside world through one journalist. Raymond Daniel of the New York Times had been tracking the purge of the German economy. Important positions in business and industry were still held by the same people who had served under the dictatorship. When his reporting turned to Bavaria, the spotlight fell on Patton. Daniel recorded how Patton once asked one of his military government officers, a man responsible for investigating bankers tied to the regime, was it not foolish to insist on clearing out Germany's smartest people? The smartest people. That was how Patton saw them, not as builders of mass death machines, but as a capable class, useful talents whom any rational ruler would want on their side. This was the language of a bureaucrat, and it exposed everything. Patton reduced a moral catastrophe to a staffing problem. Does this kind of solution really work? This is the uncomfortable reality modern observers must face. On the narrowest level, Patton's view of this system was not entirely wrong. A ruined country cannot rebuild itself by only relying on the innocent, because, by definition, innocent people in a totalitarian state are never allowed near the levers of power. Every post-war occupier, in any era, eventually reached some version of this compromise, which was exactly the deal Patton wanted to make public. What set Patton apart wasn't that he saw this dilemma, but that he refused to bear its moral weight. He treated rebuilding a society that had bred the Oradour-sur-Glane concentration camp like rebuilding a railroad. Just find people who knew how the gears turned and put them back in place. At the top of the command chain, Patton's views had become a documented problem. On August 11th, he made his position clear in writing, arguing that a massive purge policy was unworkable and that useful Germans must be kept. The reply came in the authoritative voice of Eisenhower, with no room for misunderstanding. Eisenhower reminded Patton that destroying the ideology of the regime they had fought against was one of the core goals of the war. Occupation Directive Number 1067 clearly forbade keeping former party members for administrative convenience, efficiency, or expedience. Eisenhower also added that denazification was an extremely sensitive issue on both sides of the Atlantic, and that mishandling it would instantly attract relentless media and political scrutiny. It was both a warning and a rebuke, which Patton ignored. He saw the policy as foolish orders from people who had never managed to keep a starving province running. The friction between frontline generals and the high command had survived the Sicily crisis, survived the slap incident that nearly ended Patton's career years earlier. And now this policy was tangled in the core issue Eisenhower could least afford to lose control of. Beyond this, there were darker things worsening Patton's blindness. In his private diaries during those weeks, he wrote passages with extreme prejudice against survivors of the regime. These brutally biased paragraphs made his indifference to the regime's henchmen easier to understand, yet also harder to forgive. This man, who publicly claimed that the regime's officials were just useful professionals, revealed in his private diaries a thorough contempt. A contempt that let him look at the ruins of concentration camps and see nothing but a labor shortage. By early autumn 1945, confrontation was inevitable. Bavaria, under Patton, remained full of regime veterans. He viewed this arrangement as normal and showed clear distaste for anyone calling it a scandal. The media watched. Eisenhower's headquarters watched. The orders were clear, the policy fixed. Yet the most decorated general in the United States Army openly defied it, firmly convinced he was the only realist in a suddenly overcrowded war of moralists. All it took to ignite everything was a microphone and an offhand boast. Patton, a man who never learned to keep his mouth shut, was about to hand both over willingly. All of this happened on the 27th of September, 1945, a room and a routine press conference. Patton was long tired of the issue of denazification, and his weariness made him reckless. When reporters pressed him again about why so many former German party members still held key positions in the Bavaria he governed, he casually offered a metaphor to settle the dull debate. Patton told them that this matter about the party was really just like the old family feud between the Democrats and the Republicans. When someone is after a job, they naturally side with the winner. That does not say anything about their true beliefs, but Patton's comparison was terribly misguided. He was not done yet. He did not understand why the issue was so blown out of proportion. He said he did not want to be king of Bavaria. He proposed that the surest way to make the occupation succeed was to show the defeated Germans just how great the Americans really were. In just a few sentences, Patton publicly voiced those unspeakable and outrageous opinions. He equated the ideology behind the concentration camps he had witnessed himself in April with ordinary party politics, just a matter of picking sides for personal gain, nothing worth losing sleep over for any sensible person. He openly disparaged the policies that the highest commanders carried personally and were required to enforce. What is more, he said all this on the record, facing a group of reporters who exactly knew they had explosive news. The news spread fast and swept every corner. What had only been an internal dispute between frontline generals and headquarters became headline news across 2 continents, exploding at the worst possible moment. Denazification was the very foundation of American credibility in the entire occupation. It proved the war was about more than territorial conquest, and Patton had just told the whole world that those in power in Bavaria thought the whole thing was overblown. At Eisenhower's headquarters, the grand industrial building in Frankfurt, serving as the command center, the transcript of Patton's remarks landed on the desk of the one person who could never ignore it. Eisenhower and Patton's friendship went back decades, to the years between the 2 world wars when they were both ambitious officers, betting their careers on the future of tanks. Eisenhower had protected Patton before. Years earlier, when a slap scandal should have ended Patton's career, Eisenhower shielded him and took him back because the Army needed his unique skill at encirclement. No living commander was more valued by Eisenhower in open combat, and few had a closer friendship with him than Patton. Yet none of that survived after the 22nd of September. Eisenhower sent his political advisor, Robert Murphy, to Bavaria to investigate how Patton was managing the place, and the findings were devastating for Patton. The government Patton chaired in Bavaria was found to be tangled like threads with those tainted figures it was supposed to completely remove. Under heavy pressure, the Bavarian Prime Minister, who had always partnered with Patton, was forced out and replaced by a veteran with a genuine record of resisting the regime. The administrative machine Patton had fiercely defended as indispensable was falling apart right around him. Eisenhower then summoned Patton to Frankfurt. According to the records that survive, that meeting was anything but calm. Eisenhower's patience with a friendship that spanned 30 years and a world war had finally run out. As the story goes, he told his oldest friend that Patton had shattered the backbone of the entire policy. It was no longer about competence or whether Bavaria's lights could stay on. Patton had made himself the public face of opposition to something the occupation absolutely could not afford to fail at. And no friendship, however deep, could outweigh that. The break came on the 2nd of October. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army, the army that had marched across France and into Germany, and stripped of his office as military governor of Bavaria. He was reassigned to the 15th Army, an army that existed mostly on paper, a headquarters tasked only with compiling the written history of a war already over. The conqueror was sent to archive the record of his own vanished glory. At last, the ending foreshadowed from the start was fully realized. George Patton did not fall before the German army. He defeated the German army. He fell defending those German prisoners of war, the clerks, officials, and useful talents who refused to break with the regime, those he insisted on keeping behind their desks. He had walked through the Ohlendorf concentration camp and seen with his own eyes what those desks ultimately produced. Yet 5 months later, he exhausted his command authority, his reputation, and his closest lifelong friendship to shelter the very people who ran that machine. This man, who had never lost anything his enemies could take from him, lost everything because of one statement he chose to say out loud. His reckless big mouth cost him everything. As Patton later bitterly recalled, he knew exactly who had done it and why. He said he had just been fired by the best friend he ever had. There was no enemy in that remark. There never had been. Patton's final disaster was entirely his own making, built brick by the words he could not restrain himself from defending a belief that, after all moral teaching was stripped away, those who had served one of the most evil regimes in modern history were still the smartest people in Germany, too valuable to discard. It was the autumn of 1945. Patton had only 11 weeks left to live, though he did not know it. What he did know was that the war had taken everything from his life, and the friend who had carried him through every disgrace had finally abandoned him completely. George Patton never saw with his own eyes what the argument that destroyed him eventually turned into. On the 9th of December, 1945, a car accident near Mannheim broke his cervical vertebrae. He agonized without being able to move for 12 days and died on the 21st. He was 60 years old, and until his death, he bore the disgrace of being a general dismissed, over the issue of how to handle prisoners from the Third Reich. Less than 3 years after he was buried, the world started to accept that he had been right all along. The men he wanted to keep at their desks did not disappear. They organized themselves. Under the guidance of the man who had been the former chief of staff of that regime's army, a man whose subordinates had drafted orders, turning the Eastern Front into a war of extermination, hundreds of former German officers were quietly recruited to write the history of that war for the United States Army. They drafted thousands of manuscripts and were instructed to leave out anything that would damage the image of the German army. The final product was exactly the story the generals had first sketched in the Nuremberg memoranda, now stamped with American authority. A clean army, a noble war fought on the Eastern Front, and military honor untouched by the regime's crimes. The defeated were given the power to write their own story, and they portrayed themselves as innocent. The reason for this was exactly what Patton had painfully sensed before others at the high command were willing to say it out loud. The enemy had changed. Because the Soviet Union had now become a threat, the United States needed German soldiers, their knowledge, their experience, and soon their rearmed divisions standing on the new front line. No country could recruit an army it had just condemned as criminals. So the condemnation was quietly put aside. In 1951, it was Eisenhower, the very man who had smashed Patton's career over the same issue, who stood on German soil to declare that ordinary German soldiers were truly different from the dictator's criminal gangs. This was almost word for word the very distinction Patton had outlined to reporters 6 years earlier in that press room, a distinction that had cost him his command. This is a cold bill that anyone honestly facing it would find hard to swallow. Patton was punished not because he was wrong, but because he spoke too early and too loudly. The words he said in September 1945 became the policy the United States government adopted in the early 1950s. The core belief was exactly the same, only the timing was different, and timing decides everything. In 1945, with the concentration camps freshly liberated and the world still counting the dead, drawing that line was a scandal that ended careers. 6 years later, as a new war loomed closer, drawing that same line became the foresight of politicians. This makes judging Patton complicated, and the story history tells offers no gentle verdict. He was not fully exonerated because he proved right. The facts he foresaw are precisely what make us most uneasy. The world's anger over the regime's prisoners had an expiration date, and usefulness eventually outweighed guilt. Patton mistook a moral failing. The West was not yet ready to commit for basic common sense, and he said it years too soon. The people he once protected lived decades longer than he did. Their version of the war story circulated half a century longer than his taught, believed, and printed in respectable books until the 1990s, when a new generation of historians finally exposed it. George Patton, who once vomited at the sight of the horrors of the Ohrdruf concentration camp, lost everything because he insisted that the men who built it were too useful to discard. History waited until he died peacefully, then quietly agreed with his view.